So, three questions. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? And how do we get there? These are three very important questions that humanity is asking itself at the moment, and I'll explain more in a while. But firstly, where are we now? We've got to understand that what we think of as normal, a normal Saturday, a normal Thursday in Barcelona, in London, in Manchester, is not normal, because the amount of energy we now use to underpin our lives, to deliver society's goals, has increased every year, decade after decade, more and more energy, many, many times more than our ancestors used. If we look now since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the amount of energy underpinning the average world per capita lifestyle has gone up dramatically, more from the 50s, from the 70s, and it's coal, oil and gas. We're using huge amounts of energy to underpin our lives and deliver society's goals, but I'm not saying that using energy is wrong, because using energy can be good. We have the Rolling Stones, we have the air ambulance, we have the hospitals, we have schools, we have lots of good things from energy. But we're also using enormous amounts of energy for things we don't need, designing things, as the speaker said earlier, deliberately to break many years before they need, designer obsolescence, buying things we don't need, dragging products around the world. We're using too much energy, we're using more than we need, we're using it in a very wasteful way. And this extreme energy normality that we've got so used to is now causing us big problems. 150 years of burning this stuff has changed the world. If we look back over time, we have 400,000 years. We plot out planetary temperature, red, in carbon dioxide levels, pre-industrial, blue. And of course, they're not steady. They're going up and down as we have ice ages and interglacial periods. But they're moving between 180 and 280 parts per million carbon dioxide. In the blink of an eye, in 150 years, we've pushed carbon dioxide levels above 400 parts per million. But fortunately, the world has got together and recognized this. The targets agreed in the Paris Agreement are very ambitious, and they recognize we must be well below 2 degrees C and pursue all efforts to limit warming to 1 degree C above pre-industrial levels, which is brilliant. It's so good that the countries agreed this as a target, but then also they agreed voluntary actions that Europe would make, that China would make, that India would make, that Brazil would make. And if you add up all of those actions, like Climate Action Tracker, the analysts, if everybody does what they said they would do in the Paris Agreement, it warms the planet to 3.2, 2.6. It's nowhere near enough. But fortunately, the people who created the Paris Agreement recognized the initial pledges wouldn't be enough. So they built into the process what we call the Paris Ratchet mechanism, where we have 3 strategic reviews, where the countries must come back together and go, what we've done is not enough, we must increase our ambition. And the first one, scheduled for this year in COP24 in Poland. Now, they're called global stocktakes. The first one was called the facilitative dialogue, which is negotiator speak for we're trying and testing out something we're not quite sure about. But last year's climate negotiations in COP23 in Bonn, the Fijian president renamed it. He said it's the Talanoa dialogue. Talanoa is a word for nations coming together for the common good and working to a common cause. So following that, the UN climate negotiations process has launched a Talanoa dialogue portal where countries can go and they can input projects that they've done. But it's based around the 3 questions. Where are we now? Where do we need to be? And how do we get there? So we can engage in Catalonia in looking at what's been inputted, in inputting your legal obligation to zero by 2050 to go, we're involved in this too. But the important thing is to help people understand what it would look like if we did this. If we can't imagine the positive future we're all working so hard to create, how will we possibly convince people that it's good? But if we just imagine it in our heads, it's good practice to imagine positive things. But if we want to convince the neighbours, we want to convince the relatives, we want to convince our politicians, then we have to have numbers to back up those imaginings. So since 1977, we've been doing modelling of Britain's energy system. Since 2007, we've been doing modelling that gets us to zero. And we've done an awful lot of numbers that show we have all the tools and technologies to reach zero. But the crucial part about the modelling is you understand where we are now, where we are today. In the 2010 figures for the UK is 650 million tonnes of carbon dioxide every year given off. Oops. And 650 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, but also most of that comes from burning fossil fuels, 550. Some from non-energy industrial processes, some from land use, from agricultural systems. So we have to understand where it comes from in order to begin to plan how to change it to get to zero. But also, here, there are natural systems lock up carbon, with trees growing, with peat bogs, with natural biodiversity is pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but what we're soaking up with natural systems does not balance what we're giving off by a long way. So the two processes we look at is powering down the amount of energy we use to deliver what society needs by doing it in a very smart, modern way. But we do it without using any technologies that haven't been invented yet, that you can't actually go and see in real life, and with minimizing impacts on quality of life to make it easier for society to do that. So powering down over a 20-year period, we can make a 60% reduction in the amount of energy we use to deliver society's goals by beginning to think smart about how we use the energy. Now, if we look at how it breaks down, we've colored the energy use. It's about 1,700 terawatt hours. The red is buildings, heating buildings. The green is appliances in buildings like projectors. The yellow is what industry needs. And the grey is transport systems. So in our model, we give industry the same amount, because industry will be very busy, but we need to look at the other two, particularly buildings. We have many, many badly insulated buildings, so we can make big reductions in the amount of energy we use to heat buildings. If you take a typical building in the UK, average house, it's using 10,000 kilowatt hours of energy per year for the heating. But if you retrofit, you insulate the walls, the roof, the door, reduce drafts, air leakage, better controls, only heat the rooms that you're wanting to be in, you can reduce it to about 4,000. So you can make a big reduction. But it means retrofitting 20 million buildings, but for every building that's retrofitted, if it lasts for another 20 or 30 years, the amount of money it saves in reduced power costs more than covers the cost of doing it. Transport makes big emissions. It's about 700 terawatt hours per year, but we can make big reductions in the amount of energy we need for transport. Firstly, by travelling a little bit less. In the scenario, over 20 years, we reduce the average miles travelled by a human being by only 15%, because people can work at home more, they can live near where they work. But we reduce the amount of miles travelled in individual cars because we can get transport systems of buses and cars much more suited to where people need to be. You can have a Google Maps site where people in Barcelona put on the journeys they need to do, so the transport systems can be designed to meet where people need to travel, but also getting people more walking and cycling by creating spaces for that. So travelling less, a little bit less, but travelling differently, we calculate could reduce by about 35%. But then switching to light, smart electric vehicles that can travel 3 times as far on 1 unit of energy can get us down to about 78% improved efficiency. So if we can reduce the amount of energy we need by using energy smartly and redesigning our systems to deliver what we want on the minimum amount of energy, then we can look at all of the energy that hits Britain every year. But the question that people ask is, if we have 100% renewable, can we keep the lights on? So we did very detailed modelling based on 10 years' worth of real-world weather data, NASA data, hour by hour by hour for 10 years, 87,000 hours. And we checked it out by looking at the actual weather data we had and comparing that with the output from offshore wind farms to make sure that the system was working, that it was predicting the output correctly. But then we scaled up to all the available sites for good offshore wind farms, hour by hour. And then we added onshore wind, solar, wave, tidal, PV, hydropower. So we had a very detailed model of when the energy would come. But we also used the data set for modeling energy demand, because even if you're using energy more efficiently, it varies with the season, it varies with the time of day. But then when you have a model for supply and demand, you can then identify when you have periods of surplus energy and when you have shortfalls of energy. You can then in your model alter the mix of solar, wind, hydro. You can alter the installed capacity to optimize. So we optimize the model. Then we have to recognize, how do we capture the surplus energy, and we use that then to fill the gaps between when we have shortfalls. And we recognize there's a lot of work in Germany looking at using the surplus electricity to electrolyze water, split water into hydrogen and oxygen. Then you can use the hydrogen as an energy store. We thought that was good, but then we looked. We haven't got a gas grid for hydrogen. We haven't got filling stations. We haven't got hydrogen vehicles. We haven't got hydrogen power stations. So that would require a huge investment in new infrastructure. So we paused then and looked at other options. If we can capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere now with biomass, then with Sabatier process, you can take that carbon dioxide, add it to the hydrogen, and upgrade your hydrogen to give you synthetic biogas, which you can then put in the existing gas grid or existing power stations, combined cycle gas turbines. You can also use the Fischer-Tropsch process to make synthetic liquid fuels, just to fill the gaps between the big renewables. But if we're going to do that, if we're going to capture carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere now with biomass, we have to think about land use. How much land would it take? Do we have any spare land? So then we paused the project again and we employed a professional dietitian who began helping us understand the mix of foods that we're eating now compared with what we should be eating. The findings were that we're eating too much food, we're eating the wrong mix of foods, and we're wasting a third of the food in the process. So we based our analysis around what they call the government's Eat Well plate. It's the ideal mix of these 4 different types of foods: starchy foods, high protein, high fats and sugars, and fruit and vegetables. So the inner circle is the mix of foods that is healthy for a human being to eat. 33% fruit and veg, 10% high fats and sugars. But the outer circle is the average UK diet, 9% fruit and veg, 43% high fats. So if we imagine a diet where people are eating the right mix of foods, it reduces the amount of land that we need for producing high fats like milk, cheese, and meat. So we then mapped out all of the land in the UK in 1 megahectare blocks. We then looked at how it's used: urban, grassland for livestock, food for us. Huge amounts of the land are actually used to grow food to eat animals so we can milk the animals or eat the animals. If we reduce the amount of fats in our diet to a healthy balance, we can free up, reduce the pink, reduce the yellow, to actually free up land for capturing carbon, to upgrade the hydrogen to synthetic methane, but also increase the amount of land that's forested, that's capturing carbon, revitalize the peat bogs. So we can then reach a point where, because we have no fossil fuels, we have a lot less emissions, but we've also increased the natural net negatives that can balance it and get us to net zero. But this is only one scenario. We don't mean that this is the only scenario that can work. What we actually did was we put the energy model on our website, so you can tweak the amount of solar, wind, you can play with the model to make your own model. But what it does show is that we have all the technologies we need to do this. We're not desperately waiting for a new type of wind turbine or a new type of solar panel or a new type of battery. We have already all the technologies. And then that's for Britain. We thought, well, let's look at other countries. Who's doing modeling for different countries? We talked to all the people that we spent time modeling with, and we produced a report called Who's Getting Ready for Zero? It's an overview of many different countries, 100 countries, looking at what modeling they've done that more or less meets the demand of the Paris Agreement. We were asked to present this at the UN Climate Summit in Paris, and we found many good models: Chile, Costa Rica, Australia, Germany. We found that Stanford University in America has modeled 50 plans for 50 US states, each state to be 100% renewable powered. There's lots of good work out there around the world that shows we can do it. And the technologies are getting bigger and bigger and rolling out faster and faster, particularly in China and Asia and Saudi Arabia. And as the scale of installation has gone up, the installed cost has gone down dramatically, faster than anybody of us imagined. When we started the Center for Alternative Technology in the 70s, it was $101 for 1 watt of photovoltaics. Now even this price is out of date, it's 40 cents. Price of wind has fallen, price of offshore wind has fallen. So the trend is our friend, we're moving in the right direction, but the question is, will we get to where we need to be in time? So it became obvious to us that just doing more and more modeling it second by second, minute by minute, just doing the modeling isn't going to change the world. So we then took a completely different direction. With the last report, we recruited different types of researchers. Because 195 countries have agreed on the targets of Paris, the science is recognized. We've shown we have all the technology. But the barriers are in different parts of society. So the new report, Making It Happen, recognizes that rather than an unresolved technical challenge, we actually face economic, cultural, and psychological barriers. But because we want to change how millions or billions of people live, we recognize that the forces that shape our lives exist on many different levels. Inner personal forces, family, social, organization, work, public, law, culture. So we've been exploring to produce a toolkit of ideas and positive examples which join up real-life practice on the ground with cutting-edge academic research across disciplines, borders, sectors, and scales. And what we found is at the core of the problem is something that we've called carbon lock-in. Because over the past 150 years, how we deliver warm houses, transport, food, energy, has all co-evolved with fossil fuels. And that co-evolution has brought all sorts of close relationships, political relationships, economic relationships, a sort of lock-in. But we're also, could be culturally lock-in. Unless people believe that we can do it, we won't do it. So what can begin to break in the lock-in? And what can free us up to think about different things? So we started looking. What we found was really uplifting, because at regional level, at town level, at city level, all sorts of projects are small enough, flexible enough, and innovative enough to determine a new relationship with how we deliver housing, transport, food. And they're beginning to pioneer new ways of doing things. The transition to zero carbon is already underway. Many brave pioneering initiatives are doing this, and we've learned a lot. But we wanted to explore many good examples in the report, so we went out and we found projects like in Nottingham. Robin Hood Energy is a company run by Nottingham City Council, not for the benefit of shareholders to make profit, but to do energy on a not-for-profit basis to make it as cheap as possible for the citizen. Or in Wales, we have virtual private wire networks, which means hydro systems can sell electricity directly to the people all around them at a cheaper price than the grid, but also getting a better price than if they were to sell to the grid. We found in transport that projects like the York Bike Bells were looking at, well, about 20% of men cycle, but only about 10% of women. Why do women not cycle so much in York? So they explored the barriers and they started groups that would empower more women to cycle. We looked at the retrofitting of buildings. Originating in the Netherlands, the company Energiesprong has a revolutionary zero carbon and funding approach to delivering attractive whole house retrofits. And they're rolling it out. They're doing test bed projects now in Nottingham. But also thinking about food. Bread is so important to so many people in Britain, but so often the bread is horrible and it just comes from a chain store. Projects like Bread Matters is community benefit society owned by ordinary people that connects where the bread comes from, where the wheat comes from, and makes it good bread for people. So there's lots of good projects thinking about how we do things differently. But why aren't they just scaling up and becoming normal? So we began to look then at the wider systemic barriers. What's stopping this change being just happening quickly? So we looked across all the different sectors. We employed experts from different areas. And things like politics and governance is key, because there are about 4,000 people working in a £2 billion lobbying industry in the UK, where large energy corporates are influencing politicians by making funding donations, or they're revolving doors where civil servants are moving in and out of government and into big business. So we have to register that. We have to register the lobbying and make it transparent about the civil servants. But lots of things are happening now around the legality of this. There's an organization called Plan B, which has brought together lots of lawyers who are volunteering time to do a detailed analysis on 4 key areas. Is the country meeting its legal obligations? Challenging government's actions if they're not up to the scratch? Looking at the liability of the big energy companies. What's their liability if it causes problems? And the liability of investors. We also found very good examples where people have changed government. In Wales, we had a coalition of 30 NGOs came together and they all pushed together for a new piece of law called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And it's now law in Wales. We have a Wellbeing of Future Generations Commissioner, and it's a scrutiny on any new action at all to say, how will this affect future generations' ability to deliver their well-being? And by coming together in coalition, large numbers of people can change government. But communication is important too. How do people get their information? We recognize that 6 media giants control 90% of what we watch, read, or listen to. And we have to get people aware that the vast majority of the news is coming from a very small number of people. And if we can begin to do that, then people can begin to see the news with a different eye. But also we have lots of social media now where we can tell different stories. We explored one example where Greenpeace had launched an online video called Everything's Not Awesome, because Lego was selling Lego kits in petrol stations to children, to get children excited about oil and drilling for oil. And Lego twisted this on its head by showing everything's not awesome. It went viral, 6 million hits, and then very soon Lego changed its attitude, changed its connection, and are now looking at help protect the planet with the power of play. We also looked at economics and finance, because that's pivotal. And we found very interesting work. The International Monetary Fund are not a left-leaning green think tank. They're at the core of global capitalism. But they produced a working paper in 2015, which calculates that in 2015, the hidden cost of fossil fuels, the hidden subsidies, the health impacts on air quality, the future adaptation costs, the extra costs no one is paying, is $5.3 trillion US. Very interesting. But we're rethinking now economics and finance. Very interesting work from Kate Raworth looking at this new model of economics called donut economics, where you have the lower level is the social foundation, the upper level is the ecological ceiling. We can't go below the social foundation because people need that We can't go above the ecological ceiling, so it gives us a safe operating area. But we also have to think about behaviour and how people behave, and people who make decisions, people who are running hospitals, people running schools, people in government, running highways departments. Those people need to change their behaviour too. But if I was running a hospital, I have to make decisions which relate to climate impact, but I've never had any training. Nobody's ever taught me about it. So we found a very interesting project in Manchester. Manchester had had a lot of powers devolved from London to run schools, hospitals, and they had all the budget to run it. So they started a project called Carbon Literacy, which gives a one-day training to anybody on what is the impacts of climate change, what are the climate solutions, what can be done, lots of positive examples. Because if you're doing any sort of management and you don't understand the issues, then you can't make the right decisions. And there's budgets for training people about health and safety, about legals. So we just put that in with the continuing professional development budget. It's now growing. 6,000 people have been trained in Manchester. But also behavioural change about how we live. The Open Homes Project. 600 people have opened their homes and had 10,000 people through to see what a highly retrofitted, super energy efficient house would be like to live in. But we also have to think about changing our values and how we think about the world. And we have to recognise that we have to change how we think as a society. But that's very hard at the moment, even though we may notice changes because of climate change. Pat told me that the trees come into leaf 6 weeks earlier than they used to, 4 weeks earlier than they used to when he first arrived here. We see those effects. But we also see documentaries that show the forest fires in Portugal, the droughts in Africa, the floods in California. We see all the problems, but then those programs end and normal television begins. And with normal television, Netflix, online, none of the characters discuss it. Nobody talks about it. Nobody takes any of the pro-environmental actions that we all know we need to take, because it's all designed to sell advertising. And so it creates this bubble in which we can just pretend it isn't happening, where it doesn't seem to be real in our heads. And we have to burst that bubble. And bursting bubbles and changing how we think about things is an important role for the arts. Arts and creative practice have helped us challenge how we think about race, how we think about class, how we think about the role of women through creating interesting new ways of thinking. Brian Eno described in the Big Here, Long Now, humans are capable of a unique trick. They can begin to experience a new way of living in their mind and imagine it. And then by this process, it begins to come true. So we see the first interracial kiss in films. We see the first gay characters appearing in soap operas. And it begins to change and begins to get over some of the prejudices that we've had put through us in previous times. So there's all sorts of new, clever little cultural innovations coming out that can help us challenge the idea that you're a virile, attractive man if you stand around revving your car engine and that cars mean you're attractive.
Skru av den motoren, sa jeg. Trodde vi var gjennom dette her, ja. Den er ikke tøff, om det er det du tror. Vet sønnen din om dette her, Jan?
Ja.
Tror jeg tar en telefon til Sebastian, da?
Nei, ok da. Jeg skal levere den tilbake nå.
Miljøagenter har rett til å si fra, for de er med på å forme sin egen fremtid. Du kan melde inn ditt barn på miljøagentene.no.
Jeg er ikke sint. Jeg er bare veldig, veldig skuffet.
So there's lots of good things coming out that challenge them, quite more from perhaps Scandinavia than America. But the overall conclusion is that there are many solutions. And to change things, we have to come together. We have to link up different sectors of society and push collectively for change. Because the shift to zero carbon is actually one of the most exciting opportunities in human history. We can think of the number of people around the world who work in filthy air conditions. That has a very high human cost, has a very high medical cost. We can start eating the right mix of food, as well as clearing the air. We can get our diets better matched to what human beings are. And then we begin to talk. The environmental climate people go and talk to the medical people. And there's one report I would quote, multi-solving, the intersection between health and climate. If you get it right, you can solve health problems and climate problems with the same actions. But the barriers are people only think in one discipline. Quite often the academics are only thinking about this and not about a wider cross-disciplinary approach. Quite often the budgets in a local authority are all in silos. So if getting the streets with more cyclists cleans the air, which reduces the lung-related diseases, which saves money in the hospitals, those two budgets don't talk to each other. Partially because judiciary are all completely separate. We have different departments in local government that just aren't talking to each other, so they can't see the co-benefit. We're not engaging the community, and a lot of health investment, a lot of health spending is on care for the sick, rather than preventing people getting sick in the first place, which can actually be a cheaper and better way of doing it. But the key problem is that the benefits are in the longer term, but our decision-making is so often in the short term because of political timelines. But in this report, it brings out 10 really good examples of projects that are actually changing things, one of which is in Barcelona. It identifies the key benefits and uses this sort of symbol to show how they're all linking up. But as well as health, we can stop buying things we don't need with money we don't have to try and impress people we don't like, because we can challenge the way advertising makes us spend. We can also begin to think about the number of jobs it would create and go to the unions, engage with the unions. So the unions don't see zero carbon Catalonia as a challenge to jobs, they see it as a big jobs opportunity. That's happened in the UK with the Million Climate Jobs programme, worked very closely with the unions to show not only how many jobs, but how the jobs will be funded. And then if we have all of the wind turbines, all of the solar panels, all of the equipment installed in Britain, then at the end of the weather forecaster says, and tomorrow's weather will pump this amount of money into our economy, if we own the technology. So it's important we question who owns the wind. Is it the community that owns the technology, or is it big business from another country that just takes the money away? So very interesting report by the Labour Energy Forum, because if you get it right, and we have municipal ownership, community ownership, then you get better jobs, you get just transition for workers, you get institutions driving industrial strategy, more revenue. The profits can fund schools and hospitals. So a very good example, like Robin Hood Energy, it's deliberately designed to get that profit and to put that profit in the budget of the local authority, to give the local authority money to spend on schools and hospitals. But I think the most important one to end on is that we can actually be happier. Because if we ask people, in our friends, our mates, our family, well, what do you want more of? They say, well, I want more time with my mates, more time doing sport, more time in nature, more time with the kids, more time with my girlfriend, more time doing meditation and yoga, more time on that swing in the back garden. There's so many things we want more of that have very low carbon impact, because all we want to do is spend time with more human beings, not buy another sofa, not buy another television. So we've been working with groups across the UK who are interested in developing zero carbon conversations around Wedmore, Wales, Yorkshire, Cambridge, Liverpool, and beginning to create an awareness in their local community of the co-benefits of this transition. But the challenge we've had is that the law in Britain, which is called the UK Climate Change Act, has had a target of 80% by 2050. 80% by 2050 is nowhere near ambitious enough to fulfill our obligations to the Paris Agreement. But they've set up a committee on climate change that governs it with independent duties and powers. But then last week, the Minister for Climate Change announced that The government will instruct the Committee on Climate Change to begin scoping out a net zero goal. It's an admission that zero by 2050 is going to become law for the UK, which is very exciting because all of our work now will move on and it will become law for Britain. Thank you very much for listening. If anybody has any questions. So perhaps now you have zero by 2050 for Catalonia. The first thing that is needed is a report into how we make it happen, because the barriers in Catalonia might be different to the barriers in Britain, but get some academics doing some research. What are the key barriers to making this happen? How do we overcome them? And then roll out a carbon literacy program so that everybody who's managing decisions about infrastructure, they get the one-day carbon training that they need to understand the issues.